My sister forbade me from attending her wedding because she believes her fiancé feels something for me. Now, he refuses to marry her. Hello everyone, I'm Valeria. I'm 20 years old, and I really need your opinion on something that's happening in my family. My older sister, Andrea, who is 25, is engaged to her lifelong boyfriend, Marcos, who is the same age. From the outside, they seemed like the perfect couple, the kind that everyone assumes will end up together forever. They'd been together for years, and everything pointed to a happy ending. Until now. Because to everyone's surprise, their wedding is in jeopardy, and the reason is completely absurd. Andrea has decided she doesn't want me at her wedding, and in response, Marcos has said he can't marry her. The reason? My sister is convinced her fiancé has feelings for me. I know it sounds ridiculous, but let me explain how we got here. To understand the context, it's important to know that I've never had a close relationship with my parents or my sister. There was no big fight or event that tore us apart. I simply distanced myself when I started college. Instead of going home for vacations, I preferred to travel or visit my grandparents. To be honest, being home always felt uncomfortable, like I was in a place where I didn't belong. I was never like my sister or my parents. As I grew up, I realized that their interests and their world were completely different from mine. They talked and shared things among themselves that didn't interest me in the slightest. And when I tried to talk about something I was passionate about, they barely listened. They just nodded, pretended to pay attention, and then changed the topic back to what mattered to them. After many failed attempts to connect with them, I simply gave up. And the most painful thing was that when I stopped making the effort, they didn't bother to reach out to me either. It was as if my absence didn't matter to them, as if they were perfectly happy without me in their lives. In the end, my relationship with them was reduced to seeing each other only on important occasions, birthdays, Christmas, some family gatherings. But even in those few times, I felt like a stranger. I'd go, smile, say, just enough, and then leave. The conversation was always polite, but never deep. There was no real affection or connection. As for my relationship with Andrea, we were never the kind of sisters who told each other everything or supported each other. She was always the model daughter. She followed to the letter everything my parents wanted, becoming the perfect person in their eyes. I, on the other hand, was the rebel, the one who didn't fit their mold. It's not that they were bad people, but they had a subtle yet constant way of making me feel like I was the problem, the family disappointment. You know how sometimes the smallest comments can hurt more than direct insults? Well, that's how it was with them. Seemingly harmless remarks that, over time, built up the idea that I didn't belong in their world. That's why, over time, I stopped trying to fit in. Why force myself to be in an environment where I would always feel out of place? The real reason all of this blew up was the Christmas dinner last year. It was the first time in a long while that I actually didn't feel invisible within my family, and it was all thanks to Marcos. My family has a special ability to make me feel like a stranger in my own home. But that night, for the first time in years, someone treated me differently. Marcos didn't ignore me or treat me like the black sheep. He was kind. He talked to me as if I were a normal person, with genuine interest in what I was saying. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it. I thought he was just being polite, like any other decent person. But for some reason, Andrea took it very badly. It wasn't like Marcos and I were having a deep, private conversation. We just talked about ordinary things. Travel, college, funny work anecdotes. Nothing out of the ordinary. But from the first moment, Andrea started acting strangely. She gave me cold looks during dinner, as if she were analyzing every word I said. I tried to ignore it, but after dinner, She pulled me aside and said something I'll never forget. "I know what you're doing." I had no idea what she was talking about. "You're trying to take my boyfriend away," she said. "You've always been jealous of me." I was in shock. Take her boyfriend away? What was she talking about? I told her she was exaggerating, that she was being ridiculous, but she wouldn't drop it. She insisted I had been too friendly with Marcos, and that he had been acting strangely around me. It was such an absurd accusation that I didn't even know how to respond. Andrea had always been the center of attention, the perfect daughter, the one my parents adored. And now, was she accusing me of wanting to steal her fiancé? I decided to ignore it, like I did with most of her dramas. I thought she was just being insecure or had had a bad day. Either way, we'd never been close, so I didn't really care. But after that night, something changed in our family dynamic. Andrea, who was already distant from me, began to avoid me deliberately. She wouldn't talk to me unless it was necessary, and, when she did, it was with short, cold responses. Every time there was a family gathering, she clung to Marcos as if she were marking her territory. It was ridiculous. Meanwhile, Marcos acted totally normal, as if nothing odd had happened. What bothered me the most was how my family, without needing to say a word, seemed to be on her side. They didn't say anything openly, but the small gestures gave them away. My mom looked at me strangely whenever Andrea and Marcos were in the same room. My dad, who had always been indifferent, began talking more about the importance of family values and supporting each other, all with a passive-aggressive tone that made it clear they agreed with Andrea. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. I'd never gotten involved in my sister's drama. We barely spoke outside of family gatherings. So why on earth did they suddenly think I was interested in her fiancé? It made no sense. A few months later, my grandparents called to tell me the news. Andrea and Marcos got engaged. I didn't even have the courtesy of finding out from my own sister. It felt like a punch in the stomach, although I shouldn't have been surprised. By that point, I was already used to being the last to know everything important in my family. But still, it hurt. I didn't expect Andrea to send me a special, loving invitation, but I thought at least she would tell me directly. Weren't we still sisters? Even if we weren't close, we were still family. Despite everything, I decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it slipped her mind. Maybe she was busy with the preparations. Maybe, at some point, I'd get a call or a message inviting me. But days went by, then weeks, and I received nothing. And then one day, my phone rang. It was Andrea. I must admit that seeing her name on the screen surprised me. We hadn't spoken since the previous Christmas, since that strange accusation. But I answered, trying to sound neutral, as if we hadn't spent months ignoring each other. After a few minutes of awkward conversation, in which we didn't even try to pretend we cared how the other was doing, Andrea dropped the bomb. "I don't want you to come to my wedding." There was silence. 1 second too long in which I tried to process what she had just said. It's not like I was particularly excited to go, but hearing her say it so directly hurt me. "Why?" I asked, although deep down I already knew the answer. Andrea sighed impatiently, as if it were obvious. "Because Marcos has feelings for you." I burst out laughing, not because it was funny, but because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Do you really believe that?" I asked. "Because if you do, I'm not the problem. The problem is that you're going to marry a man who, according to you, is in love with someone else." Andrea didn't take it well. "Don't play innocent, Valeria. You've always wanted what's mine." That was the last straw. I sighed and simply said, "Well, have a nice wedding and a happy marriage." I hung up without waiting for her response. and the truth is, I didn't care. I was tired of being treated like the villain in my sister's story. If she wanted to convince everyone that I was the problem, go ahead. I didn't have to justify myself. Weeks went by without hearing anything else. I assumed the wedding was still on and that my exclusion was final, which was somewhat of a relief. Until one Thursday night, my phone started ringing off the hook. First it was my dad, then my mom, then my dad again. I ignored the calls at first, thinking it would be another silly issue, but when I saw that I had 7 missed calls in less than 10 minutes, I knew something serious was happening. Finally, I answered. My dad sounded agitated. "You have to come to the venue." Seeing Andrea's name on my phone screen took me by surprise. We hadn't spoken since that uncomfortable Christmas, and honestly, after all the drama she had made up in her head, I preferred to keep things that way. "Still," I answered, trying to sound casual, as if my own sister hadn't completely excluded me from her life. After a few minutes of forced and awkward conversation, Andrea dropped the bomb. "I don't want you at my wedding." There was an awkward silence while I tried to process what I'd just heard. It's not like I was dying to attend, but hearing it so bluntly, so directly, hurt me more than I wanted to admit. I took a deep breath and asked, why? Her answer was so absurd that it made me laugh out loud. "Because Marcos has feelings for you. If you come, everything will be awkward." I was speechless. I didn't know if she was joking or if she really believed what she was saying. For starters, Marcos had no feelings for me whatsoever. And even if he did, what did she think I would do? Stand up in the middle of the ceremony and declare my love for her fiancé? It was so ridiculous I couldn't even get angry. There was no point in arguing, so I just sighed and said, "All right, have a nice wedding and a good marriage." I hung up before she could respond. After that, I went on with my life as if nothing had happened. I didn't need that drama or that toxicity in my life. Andrea and I were like two strangers who happened to share DNA. Not being at her wedding didn't make a big difference to me. But what I never imagined was that her wedding would end up falling apart, and that I would be the reason for it. Just a few days before the wedding, I was at home, calmly working on a college assignment, when my phone started blowing up with calls and messages. At first I ignored them. I'd gotten good at that lately. But when I saw I had 7 missed calls from my dad, I knew something was wrong. My dad never called more than once. If you didn't pick up, he assumed you were busy and that was it. So for him to call me 7 times in a row, something serious must be happening. When I finally answered, his voice sounded strange, shaky, as if he were in a state of panic. "Valeria, you have to come to the venue right now." My heart sped up. "What happened?" I asked. "It's about Andrea and Marcos." "Come now, I'll explain when you get here." His tone was so urgent that I almost felt like running over there. But then I remembered something important. I wasn't even invited to that wedding. So I answered coldly, "Dad, do you remember Andrea made it clear she didn't want me at her wedding?" There was silence. Then his voice sounded even more desperate. "Please, honey, Marcos won't marry her if you're not here." That stopped me in my tracks. What? Before I could process this information, another call came in. It was my mom. When I picked up, she was crying. "Your sister needs you. Please, come." It was ironic. For months they'd treated me like I didn't exist, like I was a problem they needed to keep far away. But now that their world was falling apart, suddenly, I was indispensable. Then came the third call. This time from Andrea. Her voice was a mess. "Marcos found out I didn't invite you and he said he can't marry me." I tried to make sense of what she was saying. Apparently, Marcos had arrived at the rehearsal dinner, asked about me, and when Andrea told him I wasn't invited, his reaction was unexpected. In front of the entire family and friends, he just stood up and said, "I can't marry someone who treats her own sister this way." And he left. Andrea was devastated. Through sobs, she began explaining a desperate plan. "Just come to the venue and tell Marcos this is all a misunderstanding. Tell him you decided not to come on your own, that I never excluded you." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything she'd said and done, now she wanted me to lie to save her wedding. There was a long silence. Then, in the calmest voice I could muster, I told her, "I'm not going to lie for you, Andrea. Now you're dealing with the consequences of your own actions." She screamed in desperation, "But he trusts you, Valeria. If you say it, he'll believe you." I responded coldly, "Maybe he trusts me because I've never given him a reason not to. Maybe what really opened his eyes was seeing how you've treated me all these years." And I hung up. I turned off my phone, made myself some tea, and sat on the couch, enjoying a silence that, for the first time in a long while, made me feel at peace. In the following hours, my phone was flooded with messages and calls from relatives, friends, and acquaintances. They all wanted to convince me to go fix things. But I didn't. My grandparents called me the next day to tell me that Marcos had disappeared. He wasn't taking calls from Andrea or my parents. Apparently, the wedding was officially canceled. Andrea was devastated. My parents were furious. And I felt incredibly validated. For the first time in my life, someone had seen the truth. Not because I had said anything, but because they simply observed how my family treated me. And they decided that wasn't right. Days went by, but Andrea didn't give up. Somehow she got my new number and shared it with everyone. Within hours, my phone was flooded with hate messages from her friends, acquaintances, and even distant relatives. Then came the physical attacks. First, someone covered my car in eggs. Then I found my mailbox smashed. One night, I even found a threatening note stuck to my door. And when I thought it couldn't go any further, Andrea slashed all 4 tires on my car. That was enough. Thanks to advice from people on the internet, I had installed security cameras. And with all the evidence I collected, I went straight to the police. Andrea was arrested. My parents, instead of supporting me, told me it was just a joke and that I was ruining my sister's life over a few pranks. But I was no longer willing to be their victim. After a legal process, Andrea was sentenced to a year of probation, mandatory therapy, and a permanent restraining order. My parents never forgave me for that. But honestly, for the first time in my life, I felt free. In the days following the wedding's cancellation, my phone didn't stop ringing. My family went from desperation to anger. Since they didn't get the response they wanted from me, they started with emotional manipulation. "How can you do this to us? You're selfish. Your sister is devastated and it's your fault." But this time, I didn't fall for their game. Because the truth was, I hadn't done anything. I wasn't the one who decided to exclude my sister from an important event. I wasn't the one who created non-existent drama based on insecurities. And I definitely wasn't the one who ruined the wedding. But in my family's eyes, I was always the problem. This made me reflect on my childhood and teenage years, on all the times I was treated like the problematic child. I grew up with a constant sense of inadequacy. From a young age, I knew I was different. While my sister excelled at everything she did, captain of the debate team, president of the student council, the perfect daughter, I felt like a shadow in her world. What hurt the most wasn't that my parents loved her more than me. It was that they never tried to understand me. For years, I struggled with social anxiety, But in my family, we didn't talk about mental health. Whenever I tried to explain how I felt, my mother minimized it with phrases like, "Don't be dramatic. You're just looking for attention." My dad, on the other hand, would say, "You have to learn to be strong. No one's going to have patience with you in the real world." When I had my first panic attack at school, no one in my family supported me. Andrea even made fun of me with her friends. "My sister is so weird," I heard her say once. "She thinks she's too special to socialize with normal people." That comment stuck with me. To Andrea, everything I did revolved around her. If I kept my distance, it was because I wanted to act interesting. If I left home during vacations, it was because I wanted attention. She never considered that maybe I just didn't want to be there. When I went to college, I found real help for the first time. I went to therapy, and I met a wonderful doctor who helped me understand what was happening to me. I learned that my social anxiety wasn't a character flaw, but a real condition that could be treated. But when I tried to talk to my family about it, they didn't want to listen. My mom just said, "Doctors always invent diseases to justify people's weakness." Andrea rolled her eyes and said, "Oh, Valeria, always with your excuses." That was when I decided to stop trying to fit into a place where I was never welcome. And now, years later, when I had finally found some peace away from them, they wanted to drag me back into their chaos. If the story had ended with the wedding's cancellation, maybe I could have closed this chapter of my life and moved on. But Andrea wasn't willing to leave me alone. Somehow, she got my new number and shared it with everyone. My phone started filling up with messages from people I didn't know. Andrea's friends, distant relatives, even complete strangers who had taken her side. "You're a damn selfish person. You destroyed your sister's life. I hope you're proud of what you did." At first I tried to ignore it, but Andrea didn't stop there. It started with small things. Eggs on my car, notes with insults in my mailbox. Then someone, obviously her, tried to open my apartment door in the middle of the night. That was what led me to install security cameras. Thanks to the advice of several friends and people on Reddit, I started documenting everything. I recorded every message, every call, every attempt at contact. But the last straw was when I found my car with slashed tires and a threatening message written on the windshield. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Andrea's. My parents, of course, minimized everything. "She's just hurt," they said. "You have to understand what she's going through." Excuse me? Understand her? My sister had gone from being toxic to being dangerous, and my parents still wanted me to be the one to apologize. But this time I wasn't going to stand by. I got in touch with a lawyer, and with all the evidence I'd gathered, videos, messages, witnesses, we built a solid case against her. When Andrea received the restraining order, she tried to negotiate. She sent me messages begging me to drop it, saying she didn't want any legal trouble. But it was too late. In court, the judge had no mercy. Andrea was charged with harassment, vandalism, and attempted breaking and entering. She was given a permanent restraining order, a year of probation, and mandatory therapy. My parents reacted as always, blaming me. "I can't believe you ruined your sister's life over something silly." My mom even suggested that I should be the one to move away, as if Andrea harassing me was my responsibility. That was what made me make the final decision. I blocked their numbers. I stopped replying to emails. I walked away from them forever. I got a new apartment in a building with 24-hour security. I changed my number again. I closed my social media and focused on my future. To my surprise, this experience ended up opening an unexpected door. An acquaintance, who had followed my story and admired how I handled the situation, offered me a job. Now, for the first time in my life, I feel truly free. Free from guilt, from expectations, from constant rejection. I am not the problematic daughter. I am not the villain in my sister's story. I am simply Valeria, building the life I always deserved. And if there's one thing I learned from all this, it's that sometimes family isn't who you're born with, but who you choose. I have found friends who support me, people who genuinely care about me, and that's worth more than any blood tie. To everyone who supported me, thank you. Thank you for reminding me that I'm not alone. And to those who still hesitate to walk away from a toxic family, I say this: don't feel guilty for protecting yourself. There's no obligation to maintain a bond with people who destroy you. Living well is the best revenge. And I plan to live my life to the fullest, without looking back.